Welcome to the Lazy CEO podcast, where Jim Schleckser, author of Great CEOs Are Lazy and founder of the CEO Project, features compelling experts and topics for CEOs of mid to large size companies. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to another Lazy CEO podcast. My name is Jim Schleckser. I'm your host and the founder of the CEO Project. Well, today we're going to talk about, I think, a topic that really everybody is interested in, excuse me, and, maybe struggling to understand. So we have an expert in the area of DEI, both sort of traditional DEI as well as intergenerational inclusion and equity, Raven Solomon from Raven Solomon Enterprises. Welcome, Raven.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate you having me.
Well, thank you. This is such an important topic, and I don't think anybody's really cracked the code yet on how to do this well. And I'm hoping you can help us think about it and maybe improve our performance in this area as we try to enhance our teams and get better answers by bringing all the people around the table. So tell me, just how did you come to this topic? How did this become important for you? What kind of background did you have that brought you to this level of expertise?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I started my career fresh out of college, going into a managerial program at an organization you may have heard of called PepsiCo, specifically within their Frito-Lay business. And so coming right out of college, going into a managerial training program, running a chip route for about a year, and then being handed a team of 16 men who were old enough to be my parents.
Yeah.
And so, and sometimes even grandparents. And so in that case, it was the challenge to figure out how I crack the code on managing up the generational ladder. How do I gain their respect? How do I earn their trust? How do I display capability on a consistent basis confidently? And so a lot of my peers struggled. I was on the lucky end of that and cracked the code pretty early, which led to a really successful early career in sales leadership at PepsiCo, leading teams of all different sizes, all different backgrounds, cultures, generations, races, ethnicities, et cetera. And so I think that's where I found my first dipped my first toe into diversity, equity, and inclusion and didn't even really know it.
Right.
Fast forward, ended up departing ways with PepsiCo due to an illness. Unfortunately, I was diagnosed with epilepsy, and epilepsy and stress don't go well together at all. And so I decided to try my hand at being a professional speaker, something that I've always wanted to do. And I found my way initially in generational diversity and inclusion. And then over time, our clients begin to ask for more diversity, equity, and inclusion content beyond just one dimension of diversity is what we call them. So one dimension of diversity would be age and generation. Another might be racial identity, gender identity, neurodivergency, et cetera. And so started in one and now kind of do overarching work on how to build diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizations, how to build inclusive capability as leaders, as individual contributors, how to bridge generational gaps, et cetera. And so that's kind of my way into this space.
Awesome. So you had me at, I cracked the code, right? So give me a couple of, what are some of the things that you did? And your first was more intergenerational. What were some of the things that you did that were helpful? Because I think a lot of the people listening are maybe younger entrepreneurs trying to get it started, and they hire, more senior people into their company that have experience that they don't have. Again, it could be their mother, their grandmother, their father, their grandfather. How did you embrace and engage that community?
Yeah, one of the things that I now know the language for, but didn't know the language for then, is a term that I've coined called a lead language. And so most of us are familiar with love languages, the way in which we best receive love. And there are 5 of those, according to a couple of really smart psychologists. And so the way in which we best receive love is important for us to understand, because when we show up to give love and we show up to receive love, it's important that we understand how folks prefer to be loved, et cetera. I think the same is true for leadership and understanding the way in which we best receive leadership. And so what I noticed is that each generation under my leadership received my leadership very differently. There were some approaches that I needed to take with my baby boomer staff and talent that I didn't need to take with my millennial talent, that I did need to take with my Xers, but didn't need to take with some of the traditionalists within my work group. And so that led language is actually one of the keynotes that I give quite often around closing the generational gap. And within it, I share what I believe is the primary led language for each generation. I'll give you an example because I'm sure our listeners are wondering.
I was about to ask, so thanks for getting there.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's important to understand the context around the generation and their experiences. I won't go too much into that, but the primary led language for baby boomers, for example, I've identified is respect. And so how do you show up as their leader with respect for their tenure, respect for their experiences, their knowledge, their wisdom, their value systems, etc. And so one of the things that I would often do is I would default to my boomer staff and just asking them for their perspective and their opinion, even if I'd already made the decision internally in my mind and in my heart. Right. I would still ask for their opinion. Another form of appreciation or respect for boomers is the rewards and recognition aspect of work, right? They've earned their way there. They've paid their dues. They've contributed the hard work, which is a core value of boomers. And so they want to be rewarded for that. So I often joke about, the 40-year service award. And I say that matters to a boomer, but don't give me a 40-year service award. I don't know where to put that in my home. What am I supposed to do with that? I'll take a gift card.
I did something wrong if I was there for 40 years, right?
Touche. This is a different perspective. So that's one of the approaches that I took. It's situational leadership in a sense.
Got it. And give me, because one of my sons is a Gen Z. Give me some hints on a Gen Z, because I may use this.
Yeah, Gen Zers, there aren't enough of them inside of the workforce for me to really put my finger on what I think their lead language is. But what I speculate it to be is what I would call follow through. And so that is being who we say we are and doing what we say we're going to do as leaders, but also as corporate citizens, right? And so that generation tends to be, they're very well informed, right? Because of the internet, they're very globally conscious, and they are also cynical. They're skeptical for many reasons, right? You can imagine growing up in a time where you're marketed to from the age of 3, where you can swipe a phone. They have to quickly decipher between what is real and what is fake, what is genuine and authentic, and what is just advertisement or what is just, say so. And so for them, being able to filter and determine what is authentic and genuine is critical. And so they're looking not at what our website says as organizations, but really what we do. And so I think proving ourselves through follow through is critical. And then also just welcoming that accountability as leaders that's going to come from that generation. Because for many of us, we are the ones that hold people accountable, right? Traditionally, we've grown up as organizational leaders, and now we've reached that CEO spot or that C-suite, and I'm the boss. I determine the accountability here for many of us. And so it's a huge mindset shift to now welcome the accountability that generation brings. And so what does that look like in practice?
Interesting. Yeah, I've written some articles about this and spoken on the topic a little bit, not like you at all, but I use the words transparency and authenticity.
Absolutely.
Right. And transparency in particular for boomers is weird because, for example, I go, look, your Gen Z employees would be just fine if you put the entire company payroll on a website where everybody could read it. They'd be fine with that. That's cool, because they talk about it already anyway. And the boomers go, you don't tell people what you make. You don't do that. And you go, no, you don't know. This generation is different. Transparency is how they grew up their whole lives.
That's right. And the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, Jim, is very similar. Boomers grew up in a time in organizations where you just didn't talk about race at work. You didn't talk about discrimination, et cetera. And now you've got a Gen Z population that is saying, hey, not only do we need to talk about it, but we need to address it. We need to take action. And so we call it, traction. They call it receipts. And they want to see the tangible proof that you've actually done a thing about something that they care about and are concerned about. And so you're spot on, right? You're spot on. We call it, there's an article on my LinkedIn page about 6 things that you need to know in order to prepare to lead Gen Z, because very soon they're going to be almost 20% of the workforce, and that's in 2025. And so with that, we've got to prepare. How are we going to lead them differently than and Gen X, et cetera? Well, one of the things on that 6-step list is keeping it hot, what we call it. And it's just precisely what you said: honest, open, and transparent. What does that look like?
Interesting. That's so keep going on racial and gender diversity. And we did a little generational, but help us think about that. And maybe let's specifically for this audience, which tends to be somewhat smaller companies, 100 million, 50 million. I think we struggle to bring people to our organizations with diversity, right? In other words, we go, yeah, we want to, we just have a hard time attracting and bringing on the people we want. I'll give you an example. We have one client in Indianapolis. They're very progressive in this regard. They're very good about bringing in young people of all backgrounds, all styles, and so forth. They train them for a couple of years, and they really start to become professionals. They really learn the craft. And then the larger companies in town, in this case, Pfizer in Indianapolis, go, look at that, a young African-American woman who's super smart and professional, boom. And they hire away from him. So he's trying to do the right thing, but he has a hard time retaining. So I think both on bringing on board, help us understand how do we create a pool of people that are diverse, that are interested in our companies, and then maybe touch on retention as well, if you could help us with that, because I know a lot of people struggle with it.
Yeah. Well, I'll kind of start at the base of what you initially said in talking about race and gender identity, et cetera. What we know to be factual is that Gen Z is the most racially and ethnically diverse generation the U.S. has ever seen.
Sure.
They are also the most gender diverse generation the U.S. has ever seen. And we don't have time to really unpack what we mean by gender identity and diversity in all those regards. But the point here is they have grown up amidst a certain degree of diversity that you and I would only dream of.
Yep.
And so it's driving their expectation that when they come into an organization, not only are we diverse, but that we're also inclusive. And so that is one of the keys to retention. Once you bring in all of this, quote, diverse talent, right? This talent that is divergent from the norm of what we typically bring into our organizations. We bring in all this talent, but we don't do the internal cultural work to cultivate inclusion, psychological safety, a sense of belonging. What's going to happen? That diversity is going to go right back out the door, right? And they're going to go to a place where they do belong. So one of the things that I think mid-sized to small companies can really do to compete in this ever-changing workplace that I understand, right, as a business owner myself, that talent being broached, if you will. One of the things that we can do that we have on our side is work flexibility. You and I are able to provide a little bit more flexibility around when you work, where you work, and how you work. And so how do we use that to our advantage? That also opens our organizations up to a greater talent pool than we've ever had before. If we're looking, for example, only to hire in Indianapolis, if our company is based in Indianapolis, then the pool of talent is, of course, going to be smaller than it would be if we were opening that up to a greater geography, really the world.
Yes.
And so the world is our oyster, as they say. So that's one, I think, element that you and I have to our advantage. The other component is, and we see this began with millennials, and it certainly is just as pronounced with Gen Z, is this value of meaning and purpose in our work.
Sure.
And so millennials were the first generation to demand meaning and purpose in their work, meaning if I don't get it, I'm willing to leave not only my job, but my career. And so that, kind of established an expectation and really a base for now Gen Z to say the same thing. I want to do work that's meaningful, that's fulfilling, that's purposeful. And so you and I, as small business owners, really do, and leaders of small businesses to mid-sized businesses, we have the ability to position the work that we do from a purposeful standpoint, much better than that of, say, a Pfizer or a large organization like those that we've worked for in the past. So I would just maybe throw out those two things to consider.
Yep. No, and there's for those that haven't read it, Dan Pink's book Drive is really great in this area. It talks about, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and boomers were largely extrinsically motivated, bonuses and rewards and the plaque that you talked about. Later generations are more intrinsically motivated, and it's APM, autonomy, purpose, and mastery. I remember making a sales call on Medtronics years ago. They make pacemakers and so forth, and defibrillation. Okay. Their company purpose, extending human life. Like, so what'd you get out of bed this morning to do? Well, I was extending human life. It's pretty good purpose, actually. So practically, let's say we do a good job of attracting the right group. We've got a diverse group on all of these axes that you're talking about. What are some of the best practices that you see people doing to sort of retain and embrace and make their environment feel very welcoming to that community, or multiple communities, really?
Absolutely. I would say, tangibly speaking, every organization should have diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And that strategy, depending on the size of the organization, we should also have dedicated personnel to bring that strategy to life. And so I know as a business owner, it sounds like another investment, and that's exactly what it is. It's an investment into your people, into your culture, that in the long run will drive that retention, that sense of belonging, which we know this next generation of talent is making hiring decisions around, or I should say where they work, right?
Yes.
Decisions around a sense of belonging and equity. One of the leading factors, I should say, in whether Gen Z trusts an organization or not is their equitable policies and their practices, how they're approaching not diversity, not even inclusion, but equity. And so equity, by definition, at least for us at Raven Solomon Enterprises, is really all about ensuring that as we do what we do, we are accounting for the differences that exist. And so diversity for us is the presence of difference. Inclusion is about making sure that that difference counts, that difference is welcomed, valued, appreciated, leveraged, et cetera. And then equity is about ensuring that we have accounted for difference in the way that we do what we do. And so even if, for example, in the way that we go out and promote our job opportunities, the way that we provide access to work at our company, how do we ensure that we've accounted for difference in the way that people find out about that job and the way that people access that job? How do we position our opportunities in more diverse spaces? I always give this example because it helps us understand equity in a different way. If you and I are responsible for building a building, right? God, Lord help us, you and I are the architects behind this. We are responsible for making sure that this building is accessible to everyone. To account for difference as we build that building is to account for the fact that some folks will not be able to walk into that building.
Right.
Some folks are going to need to utilize wheelchairs. And so with that, you and I account for the difference by building ramps, by building and installing elevators, et cetera. And so that's what we mean by accounting for the difference that folks bring to our table. And that's what equity is. And so we have a generation who is pushing us to not just talk about diversity or even be diverse. They're pushing us to implement and execute equitable policies and practices that lead to a sense of belonging and inclusion. And so the tangible thing is developing a DEI strategy. And just as a quick kind of run through, a DEI strategy, oftentimes we think about it being workforce focused and workplace focused. So we think about the workforce, the talent aspect of it, bringing in diverse talent. And then we think about that workplace aspect of it often, which is the culture. But there are other elements to a really good diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, which would also and should also include your marketplace. So how do you attract and meet the needs of, I should say, a diverse population of consumers? And so what's our engagement strategy around diversity, equity, and inclusion with our customer? There's also a supplier element to this. And so how do we ensure that we are practicing equity in diversity in our supplier base, right? We call it supplier diversity in the area of DEI.
Sure.
And then the last component of it is around community. So what is our community engagement, our community involvement strategy around diverse populations, especially those that we serve? So hopefully that gives the audience just some things to think about. You want to have a DEI strategy, whether you have dedicated DEI personnel or not. I'll be the first to tell you your HR personnel is not responsible for building the strategy for you. They are not. That's not their job. It's also not their expertise. So you want to, if you can, have dedicated personnel to do your DEI strategy or outsource it to a third-party consultant. Now,
like
bringing
yourself,
it to life.
like yourself.
I mean, I wasn't going to say that. I was going to let you say that, Jim. So
well, I did. You throw the balls in the air and I'll hit them. It's all good.
There we go.
You know, I've got a good friend who is a DEI officer for a large nonprofit, and we get together every so often. And he said, Jim, help. He happens to be African American, and he says, Jim, and the leadership's almost all white, by the way. He goes, Jim, I'm really struggling to get me and others in the room. It's almost like the Hamilton song, right? In the room where it happened, right? He says, why are they passively or actively resisting me being in the room in this way? Help me understand. So I have a view, but I wonder what your view is. I'm like, great, you're here, but like you can't quite get into the room where it happened sometimes.
I think that could be twofold.
Yeah.
One is, I think perhaps there is an underappreciation and an undervaluing of the work DEI does and the value it brings to the business, right? So I think sometimes as organizational leaders, we see a lot of the work correlated with DEI as soft skill based, right? It's the other stuff, the fluff that if we have time, we'll do. Right. But we really have to see it as an absolute business imperative. We have to see and connect the dots between top line and diversity, equity, and inclusion, between the bottom line and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and everything in between. And so one of the things we talk about is that it really starts with commitment as a inclusive leader. One of the 6 traits of an inclusive leader is that of commitment. And the reason I start there is because we have to be bought into the fact that this is truly value adding to our people, to our culture, and to our business. And so those who are inclusive leaders, we understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion is essential. And we understand the business case, we understand the moral case for it. And so a lot of the times we see DEI through this moral lens. We're like, oh, it's the right thing to do when we have time. It's not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. And so when we really believe that and we really have an understanding of the business case, I think the value of that DEI leader in the room is seen very differently. The other side of it is not just not having an understanding of the business value or a belief in the business value, but I think sometimes for some of us, DEI can be misunderstood. And so when we see it as a threat, then we want to keep it as far away from us as we possibly can. And so our lens through which we view DEI must change. We need to be educated around what DEI really is, right? It's the way that I just described it. Diversity is the presence of difference. We know for a fact that diversity fuels better decision making, which then fuels better innovation, which then fuels the top line, right? And so when we make those connection points, we then understand, you know what? The presence of diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a threat to me. It's an opportunity for us. And so it's a shift in perspective. And that comes with education. And that education comes with awareness and proximity. And so we've got to, there's a conversation all the time around, do we make diversity, equity, and inclusion training mandatory? Or is that somehow problematic? And in some states at this point, it's illegal.
Wow.
And so
really?
There's absolutely. In the state of Florida, even I think in the state of Texas as well. And that's in private business as well. It's very interesting. But there's conversation around consistently, do we make it mandatory or do we not? And to the point you're alluding to from my perspective is when we don't make it mandatory, we end up preaching to the choir, if you will. We end up just talking to the folks who already care and who already get it. So how do we ensure that the folks at the table you were mentioning have access to the DEI training that will shift their perspective around what it even is and move them from seeing it as a threat to really seeing it as an opportunity. And maybe we start to always, advocate for mandatory DEI training, at least at that C-suite level and that SVP level, and maybe even your director level, because it's people training, it's leadership training is what it really is.
Interesting. And my advice to my friend Kent, I said, the problem, Kent, is it's a request for power sharing. And that scares the hell out of people, right? They go, I don't want to share power. I worked too hard to get to this place. I'm not giving it up, right? And they'll never, I said, Kent, they will never say this to you. But that's what's going on. They don't want to give it up. And so you got to find a way to make it. And really one of the best, and it's the other guys, it's the Coca-Cola guys. It's funny that you're a Pepsi person and you're in Atlanta, but okay.
Right.
But they said, the case for diversity for them is, how can we sell to all the people if we don't look like all the people?
Absolutely.
Right. So how are we going to understand the Hispanic community unless we have Hispanic executives that get it and understand all of the factors in that community? Right. And I thought that was a great connection of DEI, active DEI and diversity with a business case. Right. If we want to sell to everybody, I remember one firm I worked with, they were not diverse and they were trying to enter a Spanish speaking market. I'm like, how are you going to do that? You have nobody that understands. Nobody.
Correct. So, yeah. To your point too, if I may, Jim, what happens is, or what tends to happen, we've seen this happen in many organizations that are very diverse, who try to enter into a market or try to make a product or some sort of service that appeals to a specific demographic, and they make a mistake. They make a misstep. And it's like, oh, well, we're diverse. We're also inclusive. We invited everybody into the room. But the fact is, the culture really is not yet inclusive. And what's missing, perhaps, is psychological safety. And so we may have diversity in the room, but did that diverse talent in that space feel as if they can actually say, without a doubt, this is harmful, this is sexist or classist or racist or have you?
Insulting, I mean, right? Name it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Timothy Clark who has created a model around psychological safety that I think is really, really helpful. There are 4 stages of psychological safety. And so at the base of it is inclusion safety, meaning folks feel like their difference can just merely exist and their difference is included here. And so we haven't even reached a place of full psychological safety once we become inclusive. But my point is, at the top of that pyramid, at the top of the 4 stages of psychological safety is challenger safety. So that is when the person in the room feels as if it's pretty intuitive, right? They feel as if they can actually challenge the decisions being made here and the perspectives being shared, and they can do so without consequence, without feeling like they're speaking on behalf of an entire community as well. And so that model around psychological safety I find to be very, very helpful. And it's important that psychological safety exists.
Well, I think that isn't just a DEI conversation. I think psychological safety correlates to team performance generally, just whoever's on the team. I deal with one organization, which may be one of the most dysfunctional organizations I've ever been exposed to. And people will put in front of any comment they make, I may get fired for this, but, right? And I go, if ever there was a demonstration that you are not psychologically safe, that when you say, I might, for saying something, frankly, I wouldn't call it controversial, right? It's a minor comment. And they are literally worried for their jobs over it. I'm like, gosh, what a tough environment to operate in. Oh my gosh.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you just mentioned it, and I love the way that you said it, and I'm glad you did, is that psychological safety is not a DEI tenet, if you will. And DEI is not a DEI tenet. It's people work.
People. Yeah.
It's people.
Yeah. Interesting. So many people have used the tool of a DEI committee where they'll engage a number of people in the organization, with a view like, help us understand and help us be more diverse or help us be more welcoming. Have you seen that work? Because I don't know if it works or doesn't work. And I know a number of firms have gone to it and with mixed results, honestly. So I don't know if you have a view on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I have seen it work, and I have seen
Okay.
it not work. In the cases primarily where it doesn't work is when that committee or that group, typically they're called a DEI council.
Yeah.
When I've seen it not work is when that council is not actually empowered to make decisions, or when they don't have access directly to the powers that be to make those decisions. And so, um, oftentimes we form these committees as a band-aid, to be honest. We put them together because we heard the employee voice and we want to say, hey, we're doing something. And so here's this council, and be diverse together and figure out
Be
you know,
diverse.
be
Just let them be
diverse.
diverse.
Like, that's it. But that's why you need a DEI consultant or someone on that path along with you to help you understand how to utilize that body, how to ensure that they're servicing the organization in the right way and that we are serving them in the right way. And so oftentimes, and most DEI consultants and practitioners are going to be advocates for having some degree of awards and recognition for those individuals who are on those councils, because it's a lot of extra work. It's a lot of also just emotional work, for lack of better words. And so we're asking them to help lead a huge transformation in our organization. And if we think that we don't need to reward them or compensate them or recognize them in some way, then we're mistaken. And so that DEI consultant is going to help, or that DEI practitioner or professional inside of your organization is going to help ensure that that body is serving as the voice of the employee base, but then they are also the almost advisors, if you will, from a DEI standpoint for the C-suite. And so if they aren't serving that role, then there probably should be a tweak or two to ensure that you're actually utilizing the council.
Two thoughts come out of that. One is, if you're trying to do something you've never done before, wouldn't you want somebody who has some knowledge? There's your comment on consultant. But the other one on DEI and sort of the change and the use of a council is that on any change management, digital transformation, deploying an ERP, truly trying to embrace DEI as an organization, it's a massive change initiative. And so there are models on how you do change in an organization. And part of it is sort of a coordinating group that's going to drive it, but they have to be empowered, to your point. And so that's not just, let me gather a bunch of low-level people who happen to have a bunch of diversity and say, go for it. You actually have to put people with power to implement and execute on that group. I think the challenge as a leader, though, is how do you do it in a way that your voice doesn't drown out everybody else? And I think that goes to your point of inclusive leadership. How do you share leadership in a group like that? Because it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's absolutely not. And for many of us, again, that generational aspect comes into it so clearly for me. For many of us, we are used to needing to have the answer. We're used to needing to be the expert, right? We're the leader. We're the CEO. We need to know it all. We need to be it all. That's our job. It's not. And so in the case of DEI, we are so not the experts that it can be really uncomfortable for us because we have to occupy that learner seat on an everyday basis. We have to default to the community that we are trying to serve or trying to create some degree of accessibility for or equity for, et cetera. And so we are not the experts in someone else's experience. And so that puts us innately in this learner seat, this space where you and I don't have the answers. We must ask the questions. We also must admit that we don't have the answers. And that's that transparency I mentioned earlier. And so for many of us, that is uncomfortable. That's not what we're used to doing. That's not how we made it to where we are. And so it's just a shift in mindset that is required. And we have to get comfortable now not having the answers and not knowing and being the learner. And that learning takes place through verbal exchange, but it also takes place through a lot of consumption of content, whether that's reading, listening to something like this, watching a documentary or what have you. There's so many ways that we can learn and grow in our own cultural intelligence and cultural competence which is essential to lead this next generation. Cultural intelligence is another trait of an inclusive leader.
This is like when you got trouble with your computer, just call your kid and get it over with, because they're going to fix it instead of you struggling. So it's in the same category. So Robin, what didn't we talk about that we really should have talked about? We missed a big element here in our conversation.
I think the only element that I would throw out for an organizational leader to consider and make sure they're prioritizing is that of diversity, equity, and inclusion education. There's nothing that replaces that, right? We have to equip our workforce and certainly our leaders with the skill set, the mindset, and the tool set to be inclusive. We don't just pop up one day and say, oh, I want to be inclusive, so I am, right? We have to actually be skilled up to do so. And that only comes through direct, intentional education. And so I would urge folks to just find the right resources. Again, your HR personnel should not be doing your DEI training. There are reasons behind that. You mentioned change management earlier, Jim. Change management professionals exist. If we're going to move our ship, we tend to bring in someone who specializes in ship moving, someone who specializes in change management. And so the same holds true for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and infusing inclusive practices and policies and behavior change into your organization. We have to have experts, people who do this work, because it's also it can be a lot in terms of emotional unpacking. There's a process of unlearning that comes with growing in inclusion. It's a journey. And so to put that on the lap of anyone in your organization is probably unfounded and unfair. And so I would urge us to consider, how do we create diversity, equity, and inclusion education opportunities within our organization, starting at the top.
Awesome. Yeah, this is a fundamental change in human software, effectively. It's a big deal.
I love that.
Yeah,
I love that.
Feel free to steal it. Robin, if people want more of you, where do they go to get more Raven in their life? Pardon me, Raven. Where do they go?
Yeah, they go to ravensolomon.com. That's SOLOMON.com. And I also throw out that we host a live diversity, equity, and inclusion gathering every single Friday on LinkedIn, audio, totally free. And it's for anyone who is interested in DEI in any capacity.
Awesome. Raven, that was great. This was a fabulous conversation. You really, brought some light onto a difficult topic, and I think hopefully helped a few people. So thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
This podcast is brought to you by the CEO Project. At the CEO Project, we work with CEOs to help them grow their business, and our members represent billions of dollars of revenue and profit. And frankly, amongst all of us, we've probably made every mistake in the book, including some you haven't made yet. So if you want to learn from the experience of a bunch of really seasoned CEOs, we're a great place to hang out. In this podcast, what you're going to hear are some of those ideas, concepts, and things that are just going to help you on your journey. If you want to find out more, reach out to us at theceoproject.com, or you can contact me personally at jim@theceoproject.com. Happy listening.
Thanks for listening to the Lazy CEO podcast. We'll see you next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes, and check out our website, www.theceoproject.com.